Hi, my name is Heather Garlish. I'm FMI Senior Vice President for Communications, Marketing, and Consumer Affairs. As the Food Industry Association, FMI represents food retailers and their suppliers to advance a healthier, safer, and more efficient food supply chain. We bring together a wide range of members across the value chain, from retailers that sell to consumers to producers that supply food and other products, as well as the wide variety of companies providing critical services to the food industry. In a moment, you'll hear from Andy Harig, Vice President of Tax, Trade, Sustainability, and Policy Development at FMI, and Dr. Ricky Volpe, Associate Professor of Agribusiness at Cal Poly, where he specializes in food retail and supply chain management, transportation and logistics, and food prices and data analysis. They're going to talk about the many factors in the U.S. and abroad impacting the cost of food at grocery stores. While supply chain issues during the pandemic played a significant role in the availability and the cost of food, and some of these issues do linger, there are other factors influencing the price of foods Americans regularly serve to their families. We'll also explore how consumers are faring this holiday season as they stretch their budgets to afford traditional celebrations centered around food, and explore the ways grocery stores are working to support consumers and adapt to these challenging times. I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague, Andy Harig. Andy?
Thank you very much, Heather. Appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone taking the time to be with us today. So let's start with the good news, and that is that inflation slowed somewhat this fall, according to the Consumer Price Index. The bad news is that the cost of some foods continue to rise. So sticking with the positive, the price of fruits and vegetables, chicken, and some pork products are down, while the cost of dairy products, eggs, and other staples actually rose higher. FMI's research shows that the average weekly consumer spending on groceries was $148 as of our most recent data, which was taken in October. This is holding steady from February 2022 and actually down from the $161 per week that shoppers reported at the height of the pandemic. Now, while that is good news, unfortunately, this holiday season, Americans aren't just paying more for food, they're also paying more for other goods like toys, apparel, and gasoline. The price of oil and gasoline has been falling quickly, but is still very elevated on a year-over-year basis. And energy prices can take a while to work through the system. So that's why you've not seen a significant decrease in food prices tied to those drop in energy prices. But of the shoppers that we recently polled, 45% said they are most concerned this holiday season about the price of holiday meals, which is even higher than their concern over the cost of travel or gifts. So inflation is very much in the public mind. I'd like to jump right in, bring in Dr. Ricky Volpe for some historical context here. Dr. Volpe, many shoppers, particularly millennials and younger, have never experienced a period of sustained inflation. So I'm hoping you can help us put all of this into perspective. How does food price inflation in 22, and these past several months specifically, compare with what we've seen historically?
Yeah, Andy, thanks for that, the intro, and for that question. 2022 is, of course, a really, really unusual year for food prices. I mean, in historical context, like you said, younger people, even myself, have never seen inflation like this. If you look at what I think the best measure of grocery prices in the US, if you look at the Food at Home Consumer Price Index, the CPI, that's going to be up probably about 11.5% over 2021 levels when 2022 is done and in the books. And historically speaking, that's a really wild number. That's double digits. And we have the last time we saw inflation that high for food prices on a year-over-year basis was 1974. So it's been a long time since we've seen food prices increase this quickly. And it's worth noting, you mentioned sustained food price inflation. It's not just that food price inflation was strong throughout most of this year. Food price inflation was also higher than average in 2021. So we've had very, very substantial, historically high food price inflation in many food categories on top of prices that were already higher than usual. And so as a result, this is actually the first time in my career where if you go and you break down the average prices according to the CPI, the Bureau of Labor Stats keeps track of the average prices of staple groceries across the United States, month to month, year to year. This is the first time in my career that we have some food prices that are actually up in real terms in my lifetime since the early 1980s. The narrative that I've been telling most of my career, which is still true for most foods, is that in the long run, food prices are down when you account for the value of the US dollar, when you account for inflation. But today we have some foods, mostly animal products, meat, milk, some others, that have actually edged up in real terms over the last few decades. So we're in kind of unprecedented territory within the last few decades. And I'm sure we'll dig into it more, but as you sort of already intimated, these historical peaks may not be long lasting because we're already seeing some relief, and I'm sure we'll dig into that more. But since the summer, inflation really has cooled down a lot, and some food prices have actually come down, which is part of the good news that we're going to be talking about.
Thanks so much. Sadly, I am not part of that younger cohort who has never seen this before. So, but what we're really talking about here is an unprecedented collision of really multiple events. You're seeing rising fuel costs, extreme weather, labor shortages, global conflict, and even more factors, all interacting to drive food prices higher. So right now, the global food market can feel very tight and very unstable. We mentioned energy supply, which is vital to really every stage of the food supply chain. In 2022, we've seen energy prices become increasingly volatile, creating uncertainty around one of the industry's most critical input costs. So just to understand the kind of energy roller coaster we've been on in 2022, the cost of crude oil was trading at around $88 per barrel on December 1st. This is actually down from an average of $93.30 per barrel in November, and significantly lower than in March, when prices skyrocketed to $123 per barrel. Now, that is all good news, that decline. But to give you a sense of how complex the variables at play can be, despite this recent shift in oil prices downward, the diesel price premium actually hit a record high in mid-November due to low stockpiles and low refining. So it's not only those crude costs that come into play. And again, we appear to be coming off the highs of the first half of 2022, but it's still possible that diesel markets could retighten in February when the European Union embargo on Russian oil products is set to go into effect. And we could also see high demand because of winter weather. So Dr. Volpe, once again, one of the things you do really, really well for us is to explain what is going on behind the numbers and what it means to our everyday lives and our trips to the supermarket. So can you help us by sharing some insights here into the role that these elevated and volatile energy costs contribute to the black box of inflationary pressures that continue to stress the food supply chain?
For sure, yeah. You stressed really the two most important points. It's not just that any energy prices are up, since the turn of the century. It's that they've become so much more volatile, so much more volatile. If we plot the average price of crude oil on a monthly basis, going back to the 90s or the 80s, it was a fairly predictable trend, especially as you get into the late 80s, into the 90s, into the early 2000s. And then that all changed for a number of reasons around the turn of the century, and it's remained really highly volatile since then. And everyone needs to understand that volatility is not a friend to food companies. It is not a friend to producers, to manufacturers, to processors, to distributors, to the transportation companies. It's really, really, really challenging. If you talk to almost anybody in the food supply chain, all the way up to retailers, what are they looking for? They're looking for stability. They're looking for predictability, because we're talking about a whole bunch of companies that are not only operating on thin margins, but also deal with a high price of changing their prices. It's expensive to change prices in the grocery store. It's expensive to change prices if you're a major food manufacturer. So this leads to this really interesting dynamic where when we see energy prices skyrocket, like they did in the spring and summer of 2022, there is no getting around food price inflation when that happens. There is absolutely no avoiding it, because as you sort of said when you open this up, energy prices hit every single sector of the food supply chain. And as I like to say, as you move through the food supply chain, these impacts compound one another. It's fairly easy to see that the first industry that gets hit is the most upstream, the production sector, because production, harvesting, all of that, it's all very energy intensive and is becoming more and more energy intensive every year. So crude oil prices go up, agricultural commodity prices go up. But now when you move downstream and you look at the food manufacturers, the processors, that is also very energy intensive. And on top of that, their major input price, these commodity prices, those are also higher. So this continues to compound and results in significant food price inflation. And it's really important to note, yes, have we seen good news on that? Absolutely. Both crude oil prices are down. The motor oil CPI, which is a measure of what consumers are paying for this, is down over 20% since June. That's really, really good news. But food price formation does not happen overnight. And so we are going to be continuing to pay prices that were formed as a result of higher food prices in the spring and summer through to the end of 2022 and well into 2023. It's the nature of food price formation. The inputs that go into a can of beans, a jar of tomato sauce, all of these things, these inputs, those prices were formed months ago. And so unfortunately, we're really still feeling that effect ripple through the food supply chain of those surging oil prices in 2022. And again, not to be too pessimistic, but you made the point, we don't know what's coming down the pipeline. We don't know diesel prices, oil prices, they could turn around for a number of sort of global reasons. So energy is really, really important. It's been a major, major factor behind the fact that food price inflation and food price volatility have both been up in the last decade, 15 years.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. I had a CEO of one of our member companies once point to his head and say, every one of these gray hairs is named uncertainty, because it's just what kills you in this business is not knowing as much as this. You can adjust and plan for what you know. It's what you don't know that really that makes the world so difficult. So we talked a little bit here about the outsized impact of energy, but there's lots of other inputs that go into food supply, into the food supply as well, that are also very elevated at this time. And so to just jump ahead a little bit, one of the things we want to look at is weather and climate. And a lot of analysts are predicting severe weather events in 2023 will continue to affect both major exporters and US producers and manufacturers, and will likely continue to have outsized impacts. Droughts, floods, hurricanes, fires, probably something we don't even see coming right now, could impact the supply chain going forward. And if we see inflation spike back up because of that, I think a lot of us are going to look at 2023 and say it feels like a Groundhog Day version of 2022, because we have seen that throughout this year impact so much of our food supply chain. So for example, a drought along the Mississippi River is causing a major, major slowdown in barge traffic, which is critical to hauling grain and other crops south, both to the Gulf of Mexico and then west to California for export. So what you see is this is in turn straining railroads and the trucking industry, which have to pick up some of that slack as the demand increases for their services. And so what we're seeing here really is a domino effect playing out. A shortage in trucking capacity made the cost of trucking goods more and more expensive throughout the pandemic and beyond that period. But now we have drought, which is increasing demand for trucking services yet again. The continued truck driver shortage, combined with the fuel costs we've been experiencing, means that supply, the number of trucks and truck capacity available, has difficulty meeting this new demand, which is hampering transportation logistics nationally. So Ricky, I think this is a great time to kind of bring you in to talk about this. Transportation is so central to this. And what we've seen is this is a holdover. It's something we've seen coming for years, but now we're really feeling the full impacts of it.
Yeah, that's right, Andy. Transportation, especially in the cold chain, especially for these perishable, temperature-sensitive foods, but throughout, the food system, agribusiness, is a challenge point. And I keep stressing, I'll keep saying it as long as it's relevant, which is probably going to be forever. transportation was a problem before COVID. COVID didn't cause the problem. COVID was not responsible for, or at least not directly responsible for driving, for creating driver shortages or capacity shortages of all of that. All of those things were on the horizon. These problems were building into 2017, 2018, 2019. And we're in a situation in the United States and throughout the UK and a lot of other developed nations, where we have a structural shortage of truck drivers, and truck drivers are getting older, and there are fewer and fewer of them every year. And there's more and more turnover in that sector, and this is translating into a shortage of capacity. And the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, they have this really great publicly available data set. Anybody can download it and play around with it, but it tracks. It has an index that runs from 1 through 5 that tracks shortages, by routes and for commodities and all of that. And in pretty much every sector, there's a lot of, variability and ebbs and flows. But if you look at the trends in pretty much every sector, those shortages are going up. And when you couple that, like we just talked about with rising trucking rates, which are partly as a result of energy prices, it's extremely challenging for the food supply chain. And I know that we're going to get into severe weather, because I view weather as probably the single biggest sort of question mark about what's coming in 2023. But it is worth really stressing. We are no longer dealing with a drought in the West. We're now dealing with a continental drought. I mean, that seems pretty clear. Huge swaths of the United States are in some situation of drought, all the way up to exceptional drought. You brought the Mississippi River, but what people need to understand, because it's tempting to look at the issue in the Mississippi River and think, well, this affects exports. So why would this affect food price inflation for me and my family, or me and my company? But it's because this is yet another major stressor for truck and rail, both of which have been under a lot of pressure recently, because all of these grains and oil seeds, they've got to get moved to the ports. They're going to either New Orleans or LA, like you said. And so who's handling that now? The trucks and the rail, but especially the trucks. They were already at capacity. So this is a problem that, unfortunately, there's really no short-term solution to that I can see. I think we're going to wrap up today's conversation talking about some longer-term situations. But in a sense, I think COVID actually did us a service, and you don't hear that every day, but I do think COVID did us a service by shining a light on these problems and helping us to quantify them and understand just how serious they were.
Yeah, and well, you kind of threw me the fastball. So we'll come back to transportation in a second and how it works in the larger system. But let's talk a little bit about climate and weather. And let me start by just putting some numbers behind the drought we're experiencing, and to understand just in a really like a case study version why this is important. So after a summer of very little rain, the plains and Midwest actually experienced the 10th driest September on record, which was followed by an almost equally dry October. And so what we've seen, the result of that is, as the Mississippi has dropped and these other transportation costs have gone up, is the cost to ship grain down the Mississippi has increased more than 2,000% since 2020. I said that correctly, 2,000%, leaving farmers forced to find alternatives, again, where lots of times the supply cannot meet the demand. And again, we're not just talking about harvest challenges and bringing goods to market. What we're also seeing is that the drought is impacting the normal flow of fertilizers up the river, which is intended for the fields to be placed after harvest. So we're seeing that this impact is going to sort of traverse over into 2023 as well. And unfortunately, what we're going to see is pretty soon the Mississippi's northernmost stretches will freeze for the winter, which makes travel even more difficult. So Ricky, let's talk about this a little bit, because economists, climatologists, and farmers have been really warning of the impact of extreme weather for years, and the impact it's going to have on the food supply. And sometimes they use the phrase weather weirding or global weirding, which I actually really like, because that takes in a sort of a broader view. It's climate change is clearly at the center, but there are other factors impacting that as well. And that's what we really have to go is look at it again as sort of the systems approach to it. So, I was wondering just to have you expand on this a little bit and talk about how this process, and particularly as represented by the ongoing drought conditions, will impact food availability and food prices, both in the near term, going into 2023, but also on the longer term. And didn't many of these issues, and particularly this issue, we've seen this for years. So why is this now more serious than it was in, say, 2007 to 2012, when we also had a kind of super drought going on in California and parts of the West?
I think there's absolutely no question there is no question in my mind that the food supply chain domestically and globally has to start adapting, and it has to start adapting quickly. And I don't mean to, in some ways that adaptation is already underway, but I don't think it's happening fast enough. And I think we have to continue to see public-private partnerships and supply chain linkages that are addressing what's going on with the way that weather is impacting food. So you asked what has changed, and what has changed is sort of the frequency, duration, and intensity of these events globally that are affecting agricultural growing regions. So we've had droughts in the West before, for sure. We've had droughts in the Midwest before. We've had fires in Australia. We've had heat waves in Europe. None of this is new, but we're increasingly having them happen for longer periods of time. They're more intense, and they're increasingly sort of overlapping and happening at the same time. And it's getting to the point where markets are becoming much tighter. Transportation markets, commodity markets, even intermediate goods and the raw foundational materials. We'll talk about a little bit later. Those markets are becoming a lot tighter because of these severe weather impacts. I mean, the sort of example with the Mississippi River is a fantastic example of that, because that is making the international market for grains and oilseeds even tighter than what has already happened because of the conflict in Ukraine. And it's making the market for refrigerated trucks and for train cars in the U.S. even tighter as a result of that. And I do want to come back to the drought in the West, because we haven't really talked about it. We've sort of been focusing on what's been going on in the Mississippi only because it's sort of so profound. It doesn't have very much historical context, but we really don't know what this season is going to bring in California and the West. I live in California, and so far it's actually been a pretty good year, but that's no guarantee of where the snowpack is going to end up and how much rain we're going to get to sort of replenish our aquifers and all of that. It's just worth stressing that structurally, moving forward, California, Arizona, Western Mexico, Southern Oregon, these places they're going to have wet years and they're going to have dry years. But it seems pretty clear that average precipitation, average snowpack, these things are trending down. And so what that means is that over time, the agricultural community, the agricultural sector, the production sector is pulling more water out of the ground than is being replenished naturally, and these aquifers are getting drained. So this is one area, and I know we'll come back to this towards the end, where I think the supply chain really has to adapt in terms of how food is grown, where it is grown, and that's already underway. I'm excited to talk about it, but I mean, the time is now, in my view, because climate change is here. That term that you mentioned, I think it was climate weirding. I've never heard it, but I like it. But it's very clear to me that it's not going anywhere, and we need to be ready.
Yeah, it would be nice if it solved itself, but it's clearly not going to. But I wanted to actually sort of bring people back to the slide here, and sort of get you to talk a little bit about the way transportation plays into the food system as a whole. And we'll try to bring together maybe two areas that seem a little bit disparate, but I think line up with each other. So first of all, with trucking, rail, barge, even air are all important to food production and transportation but trucking is really the center of it. It's critical to the nation's food supply. 72% of goods total move via truck in the United States, but 83% of agricultural products do. So you can see the outsized role that trucking plays. And unfortunately, what we're experiencing, and we've talked about before, is an acute deficit of truck drivers that's really pretty stunning. We've seen it coming, but we haven't felt the impacts really until COVID. I think that the system was pretty good at mitigating against it. And just to put that in perspective, the American Trucking Association reported that a shortage of drivers exists right now of about 80,000. But by 2030, that could reach 160,000 if we don't up our recruitment efforts. Now, fortunately, we were able to dodge a rail strike, it looks like, so we don't have that other impact on the economy as a whole, but we're continuing to feel these impacts of the sort of shortage of trucking and the inability to sort of get things like containers to the right places in order to sort of harmonize these transportation logistics. And so let me tie it in to this other issue as well, which is that when we it's really important to keep in mind here that when we talk about inflation, and particularly food inflation, it's that we're experiencing increases in the cost of virtually all inputs. And that's where we sort of get the systems of parts. So, and that includes non-food aspects of food items like packaging. So we continue to see inflation affect materials used in food packaging, again, due to the same combination of issues of energy, labor, and transportation costs. And throughout the pandemic, we really saw an increased demand for packaging, in part because of the rise of online and delivery. Other factors drove that as well. But we saw a subsequent increase in prices as well. So if you look at something like corrugated cardboard, the suppliers increased the cost of that from around $60 a ton to $70 per ton in the United States. And in some other parts of the world, it's significantly higher than that. We should see that start to ease. We're seeing a switch to recycled products. There's some greenfield projects that are coming online, but none of that's going to happen overnight. And we're still faced with the challenges that even as those costs goes up and there's increased demand, we got to get that to where it needs to be for the food manufacturer or the food producer to put it into use. And right now, the system is really struggling to kind of figure out how to catch up with demand that is still really elevated following the pandemic. So Ricky, let me ask you again, maybe share some of these insights you have about how things like packaging and transportation work together in sort of like a negative systems approach as we talk about the price of food at the grocery store.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, this is getting into the whole idea of the black box, the idea that most consumers only see the very, very end of the supply chain. They go into the supermarket and they see the price of food, but there's no demonstration about where that price came from. And I think there's this sort of perception, which is, not really true, which is that the way it works is, well, everyone understands that a retailer pays a wholesale price and then they mark that up. And that's sort of where food prices on the shelf come from. But of course, it's as you're sort of touching on, it's so much more complicated than that. And so I've talked about the value of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, but another really valuable data set that I would encourage people to look, people who are interested in these issues, people who want to learn more. And I know FMI has definitely done some work with these PPIs, the Producer Price Index. And the PPI measures prices that are paid business to business, company to company, prices within the food supply chain that are sampled and calculated by the federal government. And if you look at these PPIs, these measures of, you touched on packaging, and of course we talked about transportation, but that includes everything from finance to storage and cold storage to food manufacturing is a huge one. Most of these increased dramatically during the pandemic, and very few of them have shown very much relief since then. So all of this is to say that all of these sort of like functions, these industries that are absolutely vital to getting food out of the ground and to the supermarket have shown tremendous cost pressures. And it's for a whole lot of reasons. A lot of them are interconnected, but you're touching on the importance of raw materials, and that's a huge part of it. In 2022, we've seen cardboard prices, we've seen lumber prices, we've seen aluminum prices, we've seen shortages for all three of them and prices for all three of them shoot up. So that's been a major factor driving up packaging prices. And packaging is just one example, but it's very emblematic of how we ended up where we did in 2022 with record food price inflation, or at least within the last few decades, because, and this is, I think, an interesting point that people should be aware of, packaging is actually an example where the food sector in general has achieved tremendous savings over the last several decades. Packaging has become so much more effective at keeping food safe and keeping it safe longer and keeping it temperature controlled and keeping it in individual serving units that make sense that we can use one at a time, and communicating to consumers what's in the box, what do I need to know about this? And so packaging is one of the major reasons why in real terms, food prices are flat or down in the long term, but it's become a pain point in the last year and a half, largely because of what's been going on internationally and what's been going on with transportation. So you're exactly right that they're all interconnected. You're exactly right that there are a lot of things going on behind the scenes that have been moving in the wrong direction in terms of food price inflation, and transportation, energy, packaging, manufacturing are really, really prominent examples of those.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think something else we need to really keep in mind here is that we're operating in a global food system. And what happens in other countries and regions ripples out and has an impact on the US food supply. We've learned that sort of the hard way this year with the war in Ukraine, but we can also see that as there's potential food shortages in other parts of the world resulting from this. The good news is that even as we see fertilizer prices increase in certain areas, we're seeing animal feed, grain, and oilseed prices look like they're maybe leveling off and even dropping in 2023. But this is something I think Americans often ignore, is how global that food supply chain is. So it feels a little bit like that old short story, The Butterfly Effect, that, a butterfly flaps its wings on the other side of the world, and it ends up leading to, major impacts on the other side. So Ricky, this is something you and I have talked about a lot. I know it's something you think about a lot as well, but can you help us understand what some of these global factors are that you believe will have an impact on food prices in 2023, particularly with it looking like the war in Ukraine is going to continue for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I'm looking at, so primarily, I think the most important factor, you are absolutely right that we have a globally interconnected food system. That's the best way to describe it. And it's just worth pointing out. I think a lot of people are aware of this, but it's worth pointing out and reiterating, why is the war in Ukraine so important? Why do we keep talking about it, right? And so the war in Ukraine has had impacts on every stage of the US food supply chain, but that might strike people as odd at first glance when you look at the fact that for grains, for example, for cereals, wheat, the United States is not a major importer of wheat from Ukraine or Russia. So then why are we talking about the impact of this conflict on wheat prices? Well, it's because, as you said, everything is interconnected. And if Ukraine and Russia, if their wheat exports are way down, that means globally the demand for wheat shoots way up, the demand for wheat grown in the US increases, export prices increase, and that effectively shifts our domestic supply curve to the left and causes inflationary pressure there. So it's not a direct effect, it's an indirect effect, but that does not change the effect on consumers' bottom line. So I'm absolutely looking at the conflict in Ukraine. I think we're all optimistic that it's going to wind down. We're all hoping it's going to wind down, but nobody knows. And it's entirely possible that it's going to expand. I mean, we're all hoping and praying it won't. But if that does, that's only going to magnify the effects, because it's fairly easy to trace and to understand that the conflict in Ukraine, the impacts haven't just been on wheat, on all manner of vegetable-based oils and cooking oils, on fertilizer prices, on aluminum and other metal prices. These are all prices that are very important and foundational to the food supply chain in the US that have gone up dramatically. And until that conflict eases and subsides and global trade and the ports resume to normal, that inflation is not going to go away. So of course, I'm looking at that. Of course, I'm looking at what's going to be going on globally in terms of severe weather. One thing, so China is on my mind a lot. China is also going to be a major factor looking into 2023 for two reasons. For one, there are always concerns about what is the nature of China going to look like, because that has changed so much in my career in terms of our ability to export and import China when we're talking about soybeans, when we're talking about chicken. As presidential administrations change on both sides of the ocean, these things change, and that has dramatic effects for food prices in the United States. So trade relations with China are absolutely central. China is the absolute biggest import of a number of major crops grown in the United States. And if our relationship with them changes, that's going to have immediate impacts domestically and globally. But it's also worth pointing out, China in 2022 had, to my understanding, the most severe heat wave in the history of the planet, at least in the history of recorded meteorology. And so fortunately, it did not have a major impact on growing regions in China, but this is something we need to keep an eye on, because if we're starting to see drought and heat waves starting to affect China more seriously, this is going to have tremendous implications on commodity markets internationally. So it's very, very important that we keep an eye on that. So basically, conflict, trade relations, and weather are the three big X factors that I'm looking at going into 2023 and beyond. And I just want to stress, we may come back to this, but like right now, pretty much everything we're talking about is baked into these forecasts. So the conflict in Ukraine, the heat wave in China, all of this is all calculated into our forecast for almost normal food prices, above normal, but almost normal in 2023. But if things tip in the wrong direction, now we're looking at another year of significantly above average inflation.
Yeah, that leads us into a good point. We've got about 10 or 12 minutes left in this webinar. We've been maybe a little bit heavy on the doom and gloom side, and there's actually is a really positive message out there as well. So even as we're experiencing this inflation, we're seeing that the innovation and the resilience of the U.S. food supply that really has been developed over years is helping keep these prices lower than they might otherwise be. And in fact, food costs in America are lower than many other Western countries. And the price of many food staples, now, if you adjust it for inflation, are actually much cheaper today, even in the midst of this inflation, than in 1992. And that includes areas like white rice, pasta, cheddar cheese, and chicken. Now, look, I understand that for the mom who is paying more this week for groceries than she did last week, that doesn't offer a lot of solace. But it's an important part of the picture that we need to talk about. So, Ricky, you've spoken about this before, and I think it's a really important point to present the real picture. But how is inflation and basically the resistance to inflation that's been built into the food supply over the last 20 to 40 years really helped us weather this better than we might otherwise have?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's worth pointing out, it's easy to get doom and gloom when we're in 2022 and we're looking at historic food price inflation, but it's worth pointing out, we've more or less weathered a global pandemic that has basically no historical precedent. And our the United States food supply chain proved itself to be incredibly resilient. And that's absolutely cause for optimism looking forward. And I'm every day, I read news stories and I talk to folks who are talking about steps that food companies at all stages are making in that direction. And we can dig into that. But if you look back historically, if you go back the last 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, you can see the direct impacts of basically two things. Significant investments in R&D up and down, that's research and development, up and down the food supply chain, and the global interconnectedness of the food supply chain. We've so far sort of focused on the downside of that, which is that a negative, a massive conflict or a weather event anywhere in the world is going to affect food prices in the U.S. And that's true, but on balance, global trade for foodstuffs, intermediate goods, finished foods has been a huge net positive for U.S. consumers and U.S. food companies. Huge positive, just to the sheer nature of comparative advantage. The United States is a big company, but there are plenty of places in the world that grow lots of foods more efficiently than we do, or during different times of the year than we do. There's a reason why we import so many of our, mangoes and bananas and Vidalia onions and things like that. So global trade is strong. It continues to get stronger. We continue to see lots of places in Europe and South America and Northern Africa playing catch up on, investing in production, harvesting, and all of that. And then just domestically, we remain the most technologically advanced and efficient and productive food system in the world. And it's just worth stressing that, because that is a major reason why over time, in real terms, most food prices have actually gone down, not up. It's a combination of we're able to pull more out of the ground for cheaper than we were able to do 10, 20 years ago. And then likewise, when we get to the manufacturing sector, we've automated so much of that and made it so much more efficient and made it less energy intensive. And, things continue to move in that direction. And all of this moves towards, cheaper food. It's also just one more thing, because we've talked so much about packaging. One major boon of packaging that we haven't covered is the extent to which packaging has good, effective packaging has helped to reduce food waste, because food waste is an enormous source of cost throughout the food supply chain. And as we've improved our data analytics, our forecasting, and our packaging and storage capacities, that's another factor that has basically effectively increased the amount of food we have and reduced food prices. So we've seen a lot of amazing stuff in my lifetime, and we'll get to this, but I think the best is yet to come.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this. I love the term future proofing, because I think, one, it allows the industry to talk about the full scope of supply chain issues we're looking at and how we create these sustainable supply chains, sustainable writ large. And I think it also allows the industry to highlight the perception of it as being a very analog industry. In some cases, is not really the truth at all. It is a pretty high tech and a pretty advanced industry that's doing a lot of cutting edge stuff. So maybe following up on your previous comments, let's talk a little bit about the way manufacturers and retailers are really evolving and looking to use technology to address supply chain issues and future-proof the industry.
Yeah, so one thing we actually haven't really talked about much today is labor, and how labor has been a significant issue throughout the whole agribusiness sector, and that's another factor that COVID really helped to nail that down, right? COVID really helped to illustrate. It did exacerbate the problem, but more than anything, it illustrated the problem that we have. When you look at everything from production to manufacturing to retail, especially retail, unfortunately, we have major problems with attracting and retaining workers throughout the food supply chain. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with the pandemic and, Americans' increased appetites for, hybrid and remote work and all of that. But that may be a different conversation. My point is that we are seeing really exciting innovations and investments in robotics and automation throughout the food supply chain. So robotics and automation really is the key to the future in terms of production, harvesting, manufacturing. Some people think of that as doom and gloom, as taking people out of the workforce, but we're talking about jobs where companies are really struggling to fill these jobs. There aren't enough people who want these positions, and they can be done more efficiently, during longer periods of time than machines. And there's still a lot of opportunity in areas like, harvesting leafy greens out of the ground, or processing large animals, or packaging some certain, especially like when we talk about larger ag commodities, like things like melons and stone fruits, there's a lot of opportunity, and we're seeing it every day. I just saw it in Orlando, Florida, the IFPA, in terms of automating the process by which these larger commodities are labeled, stickered, and packaged. So I'm really excited about that. And then, vertical farming, you sort of touched on it. That's something that I'm really optimistic on. I mean, I think, because we talked about how, 20 minutes ago, we talked about the threat that severe weather poses. And in my view, a major adaptation that the food supply chain needs to make and is making is basically transitioning towards what we call CEA, controlled environment agriculture. And vertical farming is a major component of that. I'm really excited about it. It's not going to be easy. It's the startup costs, the initial investments are high, and it's energy intensive, but the advantages, most of which are on this slide, are many. You're effectively insulating the food supply chain and commodity production from severe weather, and you're greatly broadening the geographic scope for these products. We don't have to grow all these crops in California if we're growing them inside and we're controlling the environment. So I personally see it's already happening, but I see enormous potential for sort of like collaboration, integration, and investment. Most of it coming from downstream companies. These retailers and these wholesalers and these manufacturers who want to ensure the stability of their product, making investments in CEA, in vertical agriculture. It's happening every day. It's happening 20 miles south of where I live. It's really amazing to watch. And then one final point on that, and again, it's already happening, but the solution to the sort of energy intensiveness of robots, of automation, of vertical farming, is renewables. And we're seeing everybody from, Walmart to Dole making these major investments in renewables. And it just makes sense. It makes sense for a lot of reasons. It reduces operating costs. It reduces carbon emissions. And perhaps most importantly, it insulates and protects food companies from rising and volatile crude oil prices. So those are sort of the major directions that I see the food supply chain moving in terms of adapting, future-proofing, and being ready for the next shock, the next surprise, the next disturbance.
That's great. I do think, we said we try to close out on an optimistic note. I think we're headed our way. Before we kind of touch on the last two topics, which is the holidays and then what to look forward to in 2023, let me just real quickly hit on an issue that's near and dear to my heart and to my everyday work, which is the issue of food waste. The industry really continues to go all in on this issue. We have talked about this on a number of other webinars. Really continues to be an important part of addressing supply chain changes. But I'd also just today like to highlight that FMI has made a commitment through its members to donating 2 billion meals to people in 2023 to folks with limited access to healthy, nutritious food. So I think that's something the industry can be really proud of. We're going to hit that number and exceed it, in all honesty. And so these are really great parts of our efforts that we should take a lot of pride in and continue to address, because it's it's a triple bottom line issue if there ever was one. So last two topics, and then we'll let people go back to their day. We are right in the middle of two major holidays right now. And many of us, a central part of that is enjoying a meal with family and friends. And research has shown it's still less expensive for consumers to eat at home than to dine out. And this is really a trend we saw in the pandemic that's carried forward even in this post-pandemic environment. And what we have seen because of that is shoppers are adjusting their household budgets to account for this by buying more food to prepare at home. Shoppers tell FMI that they feel in control of their grocery shopping budgets, which I think is a good sign. But 71% of them also told us that they are adjusting their holiday meal shopping to address increases in food prices. So that's not super surprising, but it shows that there's a broad spectrum of people who are making changes to how they shop. Part of that process is a increased emphasis on private brand. We've seen 40% of consumers have bought more private brands in the past year than they had previously. That's typically because those products are more affordable, but also the quality has increased so much over the years that it's now a competitive option. And I want to also just kind of point to something else, that in the midst of the holiday season, a lot of these efforts feel more important than ever. It's important all year long, but in the holidays when there's other financial stresses on households, it can feel challenging. If you look at the price of Thanksgiving staples, they were up a bit this year. There's no denying that. But the holiday meal centerpiece like turkeys, while they were slightly more expensive, they weren't significantly more expensive despite what you may have seen in the press. In fact, the USDA put out an announcement. They were so serious about addressing this issue that basically said Americans who wanted a turkey were able to get one. They were able to find them. The inventories were there. And the price of a large fresh turkey cost just 2 cents more per pound than last year. That's a 1% increase. That's a pretty good figure when you look at the other CPI numbers. And a large frozen turkey cost only 9 cents more per pound than last year. So it again points, Dr. Volpe, to what you've talking about previously about helping us understand what goes on behind the numbers, because sometimes those numbers can be misleading. So I want to give you a chance, in addition to addressing Turkeygate, which is, I think, something that's worthwhile to understand how that happened. But also wanted to maybe give you a chance to talk about some creative ways you've seen retailers dealing with food price inflation in this competitive environment, particularly when people are much more price conscious even than normal during the holidays.
Yeah, great. I mean, I would say, a couple things on the retailer side. This first part is largely anecdotal. I mean, I don't know if it'd be interesting if you guys, if FMI ran this in a survey just to confirm my sort of suspicion. But I think that the pandemic, when inventory management became so challenging due to consumers stockpiling and panic buying and not just buying way more groceries because they weren't going out, I think that was really sort of the a motivating factor to drive retailers to get a lot more serious and a lot better at just data analysis, just using their data to understand the impact of seasonality and inflation and all these sorts of factors on food prices, and getting better at inventory management and getting better at keeping those shelves stocked. So I would stress to every food company, but especially the retailers, because margins are so thin and because they're juggling so many different products, to keep up with that data analytics, keep track of what has happened, and use that to make informed decisions about inventory management, because that's going to save a lot of reduce costs in a big way and prevent food waste and food loss. And I also want to stress, again, something that was sort of really, really accelerated during the pandemic, is that there is absolutely no question that the lines between food at home and food away from home are getting blurred in the supermarket. And I think that's a win for everybody. I think it's smart on the part of retailers, but one of the major reasons why retailer profits have been up in the last couple years. Obviously, volumes are way up, but retailers are selling more and more higher margin goods. I'm talking about that ready to eat, ready to heat foods. And this has been just a double, if not triple win for retailers and consumers, because it's giving consumers these sort of fresh, fun options that they ordinarily would have to go elsewhere to get, away from the supermarket and away from the home. But it's also preventing food waste to the extent that retailers are taking their foods and their commodities and their intermediate goods, and if they see that demand is slowing down, or they have too much on hand, or whatever the issue may be, or the aesthetics aren't quite where they need to be, they're able to repurpose these goods into these, in-demand, higher margin goods, smoothies, salads, party packs, baked goods, you name it, right? Fried chicken, all up and down the aisle, everything going into the deli, right? Repurposing these goods that were bought wholesale, bought in quantity, towards these direct-to-consumer goods in the supermarket. It's a smart way to go. We're seeing more and more of it from the independent single store operators all the way to the big chains, and it's also been a major factor towards reducing food loss. Just to touch on Turkeygate real quick, consumers should be aware, in a general point, that economists have this rule called the law of demand, which says that when demand is the highest, prices are the highest. Retailers don't pay any attention to that. And turkey is a great example of that. We tend to see, and sure, turkey prices tend to increase year over year, but turkey is a great example of a product that each year average prices are lowest when demand is the highest. And it's because retailers know everyone wants a turkey. So if you want to increase that foot traffic, if you want to get shoppers in your store, the easiest way to do that is to offer low turkey prices. And that's true for a lot of foods when they're at peak demand. It's true for turkeys and ham in the holidays. It's true for ice cream in July. If consumers look for it, they can see that they need not pay premiums for foods that are in high demand seasonally or during holidays. And it was just refreshing to see that despite all the challenges facing the food supply chain, it was doubly true for turkeys this Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, that again, the numbers don't always tell the story. You have to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
And I think if we could advance it, we've got a slide that talks a little bit about what grocers are doing to help consumers. Lots of great suggestions here. They're good all year round, but they're especially important in the holiday season as well. So we would encourage everyone to take a look at those. We have covered a lot of ground today, as we always do with Dr. Volpe. We really appreciate him being there. But we want to kind of bring it home with some final thoughts. And, clearly we're in a situation where we cannot predict the future of food prices. There's too many variables in play. We can try to do it. We can try to, get our best estimates out there. But that idea of certainty we talked about earlier just is out of our hands. But there are reasons right now to hope that the current pressures will subside a little bit. And as we make our way through 2023, we'll see a more stable and I think a slightly more normal inflationary environment. So even as we see, again, inflation plateau and maybe start to decline, the elevated cost of what we are calling these black box inputs that cause food prices to increase in the first place, they take time to recalibrate. This stuff doesn't happen overnight, which means that food prices will typically remain higher in the short term. even as inflationary pressures start to ease. So it's important that we start to brace consumers for that idea that just because the CPI starts to come down, that doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be a one-for-one decrease in food prices. There's also the possibility that some of these things that look like they could be tailwinds into the new year could reverse on us and become headwinds. So the food industry continues to work hard to advance technology that saves time, that saves money, and resources in getting fresh, safe, and healthy food to the tables of consumers at a price point they can afford. Something we can all be proud of. Dr. Volpe, I want to give you the last word. I know we've talked before about prices going up like rockets and coming down. Coming down like feathers. But let's talk about what you see coming in 2023. You said you feel some optimism in different areas. Give people kind of a snapshot of, if we're talking this time next year, where you think we might be.
Yeah, I think I do not see many food prices coming down. It's actually uncommon to see food prices go down, and that's exactly the phenomenon you were just talking about. If for no other reason, then food companies need to make a pretty significant investment just to reduce those prices and to calibrate them across, omni-channel, digital, and in-person, and all that. And I think a lot of food companies have been really burnt by what's happened in the last year, and they're worried that inflationary pressure is going to peak again and they'll have to just raise prices again. Okay, but that said, we've already seen inflation slow down in a big way, okay? And I just want to stress a couple of things. Everything we said earlier, 20 minutes ago about doom and gloom, that's already incorporated into USDA's forecast for food prices for 2023. And I agree with that. I think given the challenges that we're facing with the ongoing drought, with truck transportation, labor shortages, I don't think we're on track for a normal year, but we're not on track for anything resembling what we saw in 2022. I think food prices are likely to increase somewhere in the grocery prices somewhere in the window of 3 to 4%. The number one reason for optimism is that if you look at the WASDE, the USDA World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, that's the first place that I go when I want to see, okay, what's coming up for the next 6, 12, 18 months for food prices. That outlook is neutral and stable. The fundamental grains, oilseeds, and animal feeds that we track to see, okay, what's happening at the foundation, that's all neutral. We're not expecting these prices to increase. In some cases, they're coming down. That is really, really, really good news for seeing food prices moderate coming into the next year, 18 months, and beyond. That can change, but right now, market fundamentals are strong. And I'll also add, right now, it's raining in California's Central Valley, and it's snowing in the Sierra Nevadas. We don't know if it's going to keep up, but we're on track for at least a normal year for precipitation, and that should stem the extent to which specialty crop production is being fallowed and reduced in California. So right now, things look okay. Things can always take a turn for the worse. I'm optimistic for return edging towards normalcy in 2023.
Well, that's a good note to end on. As always, Dr. Volpe, great stuff. Thank you so much for being here, and I will kick it back to Heather.
Thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Volpe. Thank you, Andy. And it's great to end on a note of optimism. I would also appreciate all of the time and attention today from our audience, and just remind you that FMI has a lot of different resources, infographics, talking points, pre-recorded sessions with Dr. Volpe and Andy at fmi.org/foodinflation. So thank you for your time today, and have a great one.